Well, in the same interview, Trump also blasted Europe as decaying and weak on issues like immigration and Ukraine. The comments doubled down on extraordinary criticism on top US partners in his administration's new national security strategy last week, which recycled far-right tropes about civilizational erasure in Europe. In the interview, Trump said countries like the UK, France, Germany, Poland, and Sweden were being destroyed by migration. Let's get more on this story now with France 24's Dave Keating, who's in Brussels. Dave, what's been the reaction from Europe on this?
Well, in the initial days after that national security strategy was published, there was near silence from European leaders. The European politicians who were willing to push back against the American attacks against Europe, notably all had the moniker of former before their name. For instance, the EU's former foreign policy chief, who was in office until just a year ago, Josep Borrell, called this a, quote, declaration of political war by the US against the EU. However, the current foreign policy chief, in a speech to the European Parliament yesterday, tried to downplay the strategy and the recent comments by US officials and by Trump, trying to focus on what she called the positive aspects of the strategy and saying that the EU should really be focused on Russia as the enemy and not the United States. Nevertheless, that interview by Trump does seem to have changed things in recent days. We had the chair of the European Council, who chairs the meetings of EU prime ministers and presidents, Antonio Costa, saying that it's unacceptable for the US to be meddling in domestic European affairs and that it's up to European citizens to decide who are the good parties and who are the bad parties, not the US government. That's referring to the strategy's endorsement of what they call patriotic parties, what are the far-right opposition parties in Europe, and its attacks on the sitting centrist governments in Europe, leading to the impression that the US government is seeking regime change in Europe. We also had comments from the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, yesterday saying that political interference by the US in Europe's domestic politics is unacceptable. However, at the same time, he didn't really seem to be defending the EU, which has been the main object of criticism from Trump officials. He said that if Trump can't partner with Europe, at least he could partner with Germany. That may have been just a poor choice of words, but it certainly raised eyebrows here in Brussels because it looked like the Chancellor was throwing the EU under the bus. Now, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has still maintained stony silence about this, but that's not going to be tenable because tomorrow night she's making one of her very rare appearances in front of journalists to be asked questions tomorrow at an event, and she will surely be asked about this subject. We'll see if by that point she feels that she has the cover from national governments to be able to hit back a little harder on these US attacks.
And Dave, what's the significance of this? Why has it spooked European leaders so much?
Yeah, as you mentioned, these comments have been said repeatedly over the past year by the Trump administration, starting with J.D. Vance's speech in Munich in February. And in May, the State Department put out a post, again, praising far-right opposition parties and calling them, quote, civilizational allies in Europe. The truth is European leaders have just not wanted to hear it. Now it's actually in writing in a national security strategy document, and suddenly they can't ignore it anymore. The other frightening aspect for a lot of Europeans is up till now, the kind of worst case scenario that people were talking about was US isolationism, that the US might leave Europe alone. Now, the US administration seems to have a strategy of interfering directly with European politics and trying to put in MAGA-friendly parties into government, again, which would amount to some type of regime change. So this is really going past even their worst fears. Here in Brussels, people are absolutely panicked about not just that strategy, but also the comments from US officials and Trump over the past days, and of course its implications for US support for Ukraine. In the document, it says that centrist European governments have unrealistic expectations that Ukraine can win the war and that the majority of citizens are against them on that the majority of European citizens want the war to be wrapped up, presumably by Ukraine surrendering. So it really, I think, represents a sea change to them. They can no longer kid themselves that the US is going to be willing to support Ukraine going forward.